What's up, go-givers? The federal government just pushed through the next stage of their federal carbon tax, even though there's clear mounting opposition and political pressure.
Tax the tax.
And that has led to protests across Canada.
More than a dozen protesters take over much of the Trans-Canada.
Frustrated. That's how many protesters feel Monday.
And it's only just the beginning. But the question is, what's the real deal with the carbon tax? Is it just another tax? Is it something that is actually effective in reducing carbon emissions? And could it possibly benefit Canada? Well, in this video, I'm going to give you the truth about the Canadian carbon tax. And the truth is probably going to surprise you. But before we get into it, my name's Nolan Matthias, and if you want to thrive financially, this is the place for you. So do me a favor, hit that subscribe button and hit the like button so more people like you can see this video. Okay, so let's jump into it. Let's talk about the federal carbon tax. And I'm going to start by prefacing this with a lot of people aren't going to like what I'm about to say. But stay till the very end because there's going to be a twist here that I think you'll find quite enlightening. And I want to start by letting you know that Canada isn't the first country in the world to implement a carbon tax. In fact, there are many cases of carbon taxes being implemented going back to the early 1990s. And the effects of those carbon taxes are actually quite surprising. I know that when I dug into the economic data, I wasn't expecting what I found. In fact, this whole video ended up being a completely different video than what I thought I was originally going to make. Because there is some evidence that carbon taxes can be effective if you implement them properly. And I think the big thing here is that the federal government in Canada has definitely not implemented properly. In fact, I think at every single turn, they have made massive mistakes, and I'll explain a bunch of those in a second. And just so you know, finding data on whether things like carbon taxes work is actually really easy to do. And because there's so much economic data on this and so many studies, there are actually studies that become studies of the studies. And the one I found that was most interesting was titled Carbon Taxation, a Review of the Empirical Literature. And this is from the Journal on Economic Surveys. And specifically what the Journal on Economic Surveys does is they do studies of the studies. And the reason I picked out this specific study is because it's a review of the empirical literature. What does empirical mean? It means it's a review of the literature that studies the effects, not the theory. So in other words, they've studied the data rather than the hypotheticals of what could possibly go right and go wrong with a carbon tax. Now, in contrast to that, there's also a ton of theoretical studies that basically look at different hypotheses and model out what could happen or couldn't happen. And these are obviously not reliable because you typically don't know what will happen until you actually try it. So we definitely want to look at studies with respect to the empirical data here. And what's interesting is that when we look at Canada's federal carbon tax, even though it is one of the most recent ones to be implemented worldwide, BC, British Columbia, has actually had a carbon tax that has been implemented for a much longer period of time. And it's also one of the most studied carbon taxes on the planet. And there's a whole bunch of things that are really surprising. The first is that it is clear that carbon taxes reduce CO2 emissions, but definitely not enough to meet emissions targets. Now, more specifically, where they become very beneficial is that they reduce the amount of growth in emissions, which is a start, but it is definitely not a solution to the problem. And what really surprised me, especially when it comes to BC, is that carbon pricing actually has little effect on competitiveness, GDP, or jobs, with the exception of the fact that there is some migration in jobs from high emissions industries to lower emission industries, but overall, carbon pricing doesn't actually seem to have a negative effect on an economy, or for that matter, on the competitiveness of the industries that are most affected by them, which seems to me to be completely counterintuitive, but it's true, and there's data to support this. But here's the real kicker. British Columbia and many other jurisdictions that have been widely studied are actually deemed to have too low of carbon taxes to actually have a substantial benefit. So then the question is if the carbon taxes are too low to actually cause any change, then what exactly is the point? There is evidence to suggest that if you recycle the revenues from carbon taxing, you can actually create what's called a double dividend effect, where you have both environmental and economic benefits, and not just economic benefits for the few, but for the many. But it's important to note as well that this doesn't come through economic growth. In fact, there is very little evidence to support that carbon pricing has any sort of benefit, but there's also no evidence that it hurts economic growth either. But here's where the real potential benefit can come in. It's when the revenue is recycled by way of reducing labor costs, social security contributions, and income taxes. And when any of those three things are done, it has a significant benefit to the greater economy. And for obvious reasons. If everybody is paying lower taxes, and everybody has reduced labor costs, and everybody is contributing less to Social Security without the benefits going down, well, that makes everybody better off, whether the country grows or not. And that is the key piece that Canada has gotten wrong when it comes to carbon pricing. And also the reason why there's a high likelihood that Justin Trudeau is going to have the door hit him on the way out as he gets voted out of office. Because as we all know, this is becoming a hot political debate in the Canadian government. But there's an important thing to note here, because even though these revenues, if used properly, can have a net benefit effect to everybody, you also have to keep in mind that this is temporary, because as carbon taxes increase and as the amount of carbon goes away, well, so too will the taxes, which means that this isn't a permanent solution to anything. And even though there might be some suggestions that this creates more competitiveness or it creates innovation, these studies on this piece are very much inconclusive. In BC, for example, the carbon tax had no effect on agriculture. And in the UK, carbon taxes and carbon pricing had no effect on manufacturing either. But they also show that carbon pricing is not sufficient to bring necessary technological innovation to industry. So while carbon pricing isn't going to make your local farmer less competitive on a global scale, carbon pricing is also not going to make that farmer more innovative. In fact, carbon pricing only works to create substantial reductions in carbon if it is combined with many, and I mean many, other tools. Things like government incentivizing innovation, and things like the private sector becoming more innovative in finding alternative energy forms. And while industry and country competitiveness is pretty much a non-issue, there are consequences to carbon taxes. The most significant being that carbon taxes have a regressive effect, meaning lower income families are in most cases harmed more. And this is even in scenarios where they're being provided lump sum payments to make up for the consequences of the carbon tax. Because when you provide lump sum payments, as the federal government is doing to those who have less income, really all you're doing is creating a wealth transfer rather than doing things like lowering taxes for everybody, which has a greater economic benefit to the whole. And some could argue very validly that using these lump sum payments is effectively vote buying, because that's what it is, especially given the fact that there's so much evidence that other means of reducing taxes and reducing costs are more effective. And the effects of carbon pricing are even more damaging to low-income individuals when they're not done strategically. So, for example, when implementing a carbon tax on something like gasoline, the effects of a carbon tax on gasoline are pretty much evenly distributed between low-income and high-income individuals. Lower income individuals tend to drive less, have cars that are more fuel efficient, and higher income individuals have big gas guzzlers and drive pretty much everywhere. So when you have a carbon tax on something like gasoline, it is proportional to who is paying for it. However, when you implement similar costs on things like electricity and fuels that are used to heat homes, well, that creates a disproportional effect on lower income people, making life substantially harder for them. And lump sum payments aside, if you're taxing low-income people on heating costs at the same rate that you're taxing them on things like gasoline, well, that hurts lower-income people even if you are providing them lump sum payments. In fact, the only way to take the burden off of lower-income families is to reduce carbon taxes on all forms of fuel that are used to heat homes or create electricity. And as you can see from this chart, that just isn't the case in Canada, where the carbon tax for things like gasoline and natural gas and other fuels that are used to heat homes are pretty much the same. And this gets into the real crux of the issue when it comes to the Canadian carbon tax. When it comes to political support for carbon taxes, fairness is hugely important for political support. And when the benefits of carbon taxes are being distributed unevenly, well, that is inevitably going to create a polarized conversation. A polarized conversation that politicians can use to attack other parties when it comes time to have an election. And that, by the way, is exactly going to be the reason why Justin Trudeau finds his way out of office relatively quickly. In fact, at this point in time, it seems to be pretty much a foregone conclusion. Now, had he done this properly, had he made this fair for everyone, and made it less of a polarizing issue, it probably wouldn't have killed his political career in the way that it has. But in order for him to have done that, he would have needed to not stand up every single week and talk about how much more money they're spending on various things and how that money is going to a small subset of the population. He really needed to take the approach of this is in the best interest of all Canadians. Here's how we're going to make it so it's fair to all Canadians. And when there was political opposition to it, he needed to take a close look at the policies, find a way to make them more fair, and roll back the things that were creating the issue. Because at the end of the day, it's clear that when carbon taxes are done correctly, they have a net positive benefit without too much of a downside. But where the downside comes into play is when they become politically motivated conversations that tear countries apart. And Justin Trudeau, congratulations, that's exactly what you've done. You've created a conversation that is hugely polarizing, is tearing the country apart, and is going to see you very quickly sent on your way. Oh, and if you want to see more videos on things that actually do have a massive effect on the economy, check out this one right here.